You've probably spent most of your life believing your sensitivity was a virtue, not in the loud, obvious way people talk about strength, but in the quiet way you absorb things others ignore. You notice tone shifts, micro-expressions, the hesitation in someone's voice when they say they're fine, and at some point, you realized something unsettling. You don't just feel people, you understand them, better than they understand themselves. That's where it begins, because understanding is never neutral. Carl Jung once suggested that the deeper you go into the human psyche, the more you're forced to confront something uncomfortable, not just in others, but in yourself. And for most of your life, you've avoided that part. You chose patience instead of confrontation, silence instead of strategy, empathy instead of control. You thought that made you different, maybe even better. But slowly, patterns started repeating. People opened up to you quickly, too quickly. They trusted you without earning it, and then they stayed. Not because they valued you, but because you made them feel understood. That's the difference. And deep down, you started noticing something you didn't want to admit. The same awareness that allows you to heal people also allows you to influence them. Easily, without effort, without them realizing. At first, it feels accidental. You say the right words at the right time. You mirror their emotions just enough to gain closeness. You create comfort, and they attach. But then, something shifts. You begin to see the patterns behind their behavior, their insecurities, their fears, their unspoken needs. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because now, every reaction they have becomes predictable. Every decision, traceable. Every weakness, visible. And here's the part most people never admit. When you understand someone deeply enough, you can move them without force. You don't need dominance. You don't need aggression. You just need precision. A pause in the right place. A sentence framed just slightly differently. A silence that makes them lean in. And suddenly, you're not just empathizing anymore. You're guiding. This is where the line begins to blur. Because the world never rewards pure empathy. It consumes it. Kindness without boundaries quietly teaches people how to use you. So at some point, consciously or not, you adapted. Not by becoming cold, but by becoming aware. And awareness is dangerous. Because now you start seeing interactions differently. Not as random conversations, but as exchanges of influence. You notice who seeks validation, who fears rejection, who needs control. And without saying anything, you know exactly where to touch. Not physically, psychologically. That's when the realization creeps in. Slow, quiet, almost invisible. You're no longer just feeling people. You're reading them. And the moment you can read someone, you can rewrite how they respond to you. And the unsettling part isn't how powerful that makes you. It's how natural it starts to feel. At first you hesitate. You question yourself. You pull back just before saying the thing you know will shift their emotions. Because some part of you still clings to the identity you built. The one that says, I don't manipulate people. But reality doesn't care about identity. It responds to behavior. And behavior, once understood, becomes adjustable. So you begin testing it. Small things. You soften your tone when you want someone to open up. You withdraw attention when you sense they're becoming too comfortable. You let silence stretch just long enough for them to fill it with truth. You don't force anything. You just create the conditions. And people move exactly how you expect them to. Not because they're weak, but because most people are predictable when they feel seen. That's the illusion. They think you understand them. But what they don't realize is that understanding is also a form of positioning. You place yourself where their guard drops, where their defenses feel unnecessary, where they believe they're in control when they're not. And this is where the shift becomes irreversible. Because now you don't just see behavior, You see patterns beneath behavior. You recognize the friend who always needs reassurance, not because they care, but because they fear abandonment. You notice the confident one who dominates conversations, not from strength, but from insecurity. You see the one who pulls away, not because they're independent, but because intimacy threatens them. And suddenly, every personality becomes transparent. Not fully, but enough. Enough to predict, enough to influence, enough to alter outcomes. People don't resent your weakness. They resent the possibility that you might outgrow them. So without saying it out loud, you begin adjusting yourself around this awareness. You become more selective with your reactions, more intentional with your words, more controlled with your presence. You stop giving people the version of you they expect and start giving them the version that shapes them. That's when something deeper begins to surface. A quiet realization you can't ignore anymore. Empathy was never just about connection. It was about access. Access to thoughts people don't say, needs they don't admit, wounds they pretend don't exist. And once you have access, influence is inevitable. That doesn't mean you become cruel. In fact, it's the opposite. You become calm, controlled, measured, because you no longer react emotionally to everything you feel. You observe it, you study it, you use it. And this is where most people would like to believe there's still a clear line, a boundary between understanding and manipulation. But that line doesn't exist. It never did. It only felt like it did when you didn't know how much control you actually had. Most relationships don't end when respect disappears. They end when awareness appears. Because awareness changes how you show up. And people feel that shift, even if they can't explain it. They sense that you're no longer easy to read, no longer easy to influence, no longer safe in the way you used to be. And that's when they start reacting differently. Not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped being unconsciously available. And that's when the tension begins to rise. Not outside, inside you. Because now you're holding two identities at once. The one you've always believed in, and the one you're slowly becoming aware of. One wants to connect. The other sees through connection. One wants honesty. The other understands timing. And the more aware you become, the harder it is to go back. Because once you see what drives people, you can't pretend you don't. You start noticing how often people aren't reacting to reality. They're reacting to interpretation, to tone, to timing, to the emotional framing of a sentence. Say the same truth in two different ways, and you get two completely different outcomes. That's not communication. That's leverage. And now you have it, without asking for it, without trying to. It was always there, hidden inside your ability to understand. You just never used it like this, until now. So you begin experimenting in more subtle ways. You let someone believe an idea was theirs when you planted it. You validate someone just enough to keep them close, but not enough to make them independent. You create distance and watch how quickly they move toward you. And every time it works, you feel something you didn't expect. Not guilt, clarity. Because for the first time, you're not at the mercy of people's moods. You're not reacting blindly. You're directing, quietly, precisely. And that changes everything. Because control doesn't look like control when it's done right. It looks like coincidence, like chemistry, like it just happened, but it didn't. You see the cause behind the effect, the trigger behind the reaction, the invisible thread between what you say and how they feel. And once you see that thread, you can pull it or leave it. That's the power. But here's where it becomes uncomfortable. Because the deeper you go, the more you start noticing something about yourself. You're not just reading others, you're anticipating them. Before they speak, you already know the direction. Before they react, you already feel the outcome forming. And that creates distance. A quiet, invisible distance. Because while they're experiencing the moment, you're observing the structure of it, breaking it down in real time, understanding it while it's still happening. And suddenly, connection starts to feel different, less immersive, more analytical. Almost like you're watching instead of participating. And that's the cost no one talks about. When you understand people too well, you stop experiencing them the same way. You start seeing through emotions instead of inside them. Through affection, through conflict, through intimacy, everything becomes slightly more predictable, slightly less real. And here's the truth most people avoid. The more control you gain, the less you can surrender. Because surrender requires uncertainty, and uncertainty disappears when patterns become clear. So now you're left with a question that doesn't have an easy answer. If you can guide how people feel, are you still connecting with them? Or are you just shaping the experience? And the question doesn't leave you. It lingers, quietly, like something watching from the edge of your thoughts. Because now every interaction carries a second layer, not just what is happening, but how it could be shaped. You start noticing how easy it would be to steer things, to soften someone's resistance with just a slight shift in tone, to deepen their attachment by revealing something at the exact right moment, to create distance without ever saying goodbye. And the disturbing part isn't the ability, it's the restraint. Because restraint becomes a choice, and every choice reveals something about you. You begin to see how often people don't want truth. They want emotional alignment. They want to feel understood more than they want to understand. So when you give them that feeling, they open. Not because you're right, but because you made them feel safe enough to agree. That's when another realization settles in. Most people aren't difficult to influence. They're just waiting for the right emotional doorway. And you've learned how to find it. Not by force, but by observation. You notice what they avoid talking about, what they repeat without realizing, what they defend too quickly. And those patterns, they're not random. They're entrances. People reveal their vulnerabilities in fragments, in casual sentences, in jokes that aren't really jokes, in reactions that don't match the situation. And once you start recognizing those fragments, you begin assembling a map, a psychological map of who they are beneath the surface. Not perfectly, but enough to navigate them. Enough to guide conversations in directions they didn't expect. Enough to make them feel like you get them on a level others don't. And that's where influence becomes invisible. Because now, it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like connection, mutual understanding, chemistry. But it isn't equal. It never was. Because while they're responding, you're anticipating. While they're reacting, you're positioning. While they're feeling, you're aware of the mechanism behind the feeling. And that imbalance, it changes the nature of every relationship you have. People don't notice it consciously, but they feel it. In the way conversations with you seem to go deeper, in the way they reveal more than they intended, in the way they leave interactions slightly more attached or slightly more unsettled. You don't chase, you don't convince, you don't force. You just create an environment where their own psychology does the work for you. And here's the part that's hardest to accept. You didn't learn this from books. You learned it from being on the other side, from being the one who felt too much, trusted too easily, gave too much, and was shaped by people who understood just a little more than you did. This isn't something you became. It's something you adapted into, slowly, quietly, without realizing the direction you were moving, until now. Because now you can see both sides of the equation. The one who feels, and the one who knows how to use what is felt. And the distance between those two versions of you is where the real conflict begins. And the conflict doesn't explode. It settles, heavy, quiet, constant. Because now you're aware of something most people never fully face. There is no clean version of you anymore. Not the one who only feels, and not the one who only observes. You've become both, and they don't coexist peacefully. One part of you still wants to believe in pure connection, unfiltered moments, uncalculated closeness. But the other part sees the structure behind every moment, the timing, the subtle positioning, the invisible negotiations happening beneath every word. So even when you try to just be, there's something watching, analyzing, adjusting, and that awareness never fully turns off. It follows you into conversations, into relationships, into silence. You notice how people test boundaries without realizing it, how they respond differently when you delay a reply, how their tone shifts when they feel they might lose your attention. And the more you see it, the harder it becomes to pretend you don't. Because now, even your absence becomes a tool. Not intentional at first, but effective. Pull back slightly, and they lean in, become less available, and you become more valuable. You didn't invent this. You just started noticing it. And once you notice something repeatedly, it stops feeling like coincidence. It starts feeling like a system. People crave what feels uncertain. They chase what feels just out of reach. They attach more deeply when they feel they might lose access. And you understand that now, which means you can create that effect without saying it, without explaining it, just through subtle shifts in presence. And here's where the realization deepens. You're no longer responding to people. You're shaping the version of them that shows up around you. Some become more open. Some become more anxious. Some become more attached. Not because they changed, but because of how you positioned yourself. That's influence at its quietest level. Not control over actions, but control over emotional direction. And once you see that, something inside you shifts again. Because now the question isn't, can I do this? It's, why am I doing this? Is it protection from being used again? From being misunderstood? From giving too much without receiving anything real? Or is it something else? Something harder to admit? That part of you that no longer wants to be the one reacting, the one adapting, the one adjusting to everyone else's emotional state. Maybe you got tired of being the one who feels everything, while others move through life untouched. So now you've moved to the other side. Not completely, but enough. Enough to feel the difference. Enough to realize something most people never say out loud. Power doesn't change people. It reveals what they were already capable of. And now that you have it, you're starting to see yourself more clearly. Not just as someone who understands people, but as someone who can move them. Quietly. Precisely. Almost effortlessly. And that realization doesn't feel empowering. It feels unsettling. Because now every choice carries weight. Every word. Every silence. Every shift in attention. You're no longer just participating in interactions. You're influencing outcomes, even when you don't mean to. And that means one thing. You can't go back to not knowing. Not after this. Not after seeing how thin the line really is between connection and control. And once you see that line, you start noticing how often it was crossed. Not just by you, but by everyone. Quietly, casually, constantly. Because influence isn't rare. It's the foundation of human interaction. Every compliment that softens resistance. Every withdrawal that creates desire. Every silence that forces someone to reveal more than they planned. It was always happening. You were just on the receiving end. Now you're not. And that changes how you interpret everything. You begin to see kindness differently. Not as pure, but as directional. You start questioning intentions. Not because you're paranoid, but because you can now recognize patterns you once missed. The friend who only reaches out when they need grounding. The person who mirrors your interests just enough to stay close. The one who pulls away right when things get real, to maintain control. None of it feels random anymore. It feels strategic, not always consciously, but predictably. And that's what shifts your perception of people. You stop seeing them as purely good or bad. You start seeing them as adaptive, reacting to needs, to fears, to insecurities they don't fully understand themselves. And suddenly, judgment fades, but something else replaces it. Distance. Because when you understand the mechanism behind behavior, it's harder to be emotionally pulled into it. You don't react the same way. You observe, even in moments that used to affect you deeply. Conflict doesn't hit as hard. Affection doesn't feel as overwhelming. Rejection doesn't carry the same weight. Not because you don't care, but because you see through the structure of it. And that creates a kind of quiet isolation. Not physical, psychological. You're still there, talking, listening, engaging. But there's a layer between you and the experience. A layer of awareness that never fully disappears. And this is where most people would want relief. A way to go back. To feel things simply again. To connect without analyzing. But that door doesn't reopen. Because awareness isn't something you can undo. It only deepens. And with it, responsibility. Because now every interaction becomes a decision. Not just what you say, but how it will land. Not just how you respond, but what it will create. You start realizing that even honesty can be shaped. That truth delivered with the wrong tone can push someone away, and the same truth, delivered differently, can pull them closer. So what is honesty then? The words? Or the intention behind how they're delivered? And if you can control that, are you still being real? Or just effective? That question doesn't have a clean answer. It just sits there, unresolved. Because the deeper truth is this: human connection was never as pure as it felt. It was always filtered through perception, through emotion, through subtle, invisible influence. You just weren't aware of it. Now you are. And that awareness rewires something fundamental inside you. You stop searching for perfect connection. You start recognizing patterns of exchange. Energy, attention, validation, control, all moving back and forth beneath the surface. And once you see that, you realize something colder, something quieter, something most people never fully accept. You were never just connecting with people. You were always affecting them, and they were always affecting you. The difference now is you can see it happening in real time, and once you see it, you can't pretend it's not there. Because the moment you truly understand human nature, you stop asking whether something is manipulation and start realizing it always was. And maybe that's the part no one wants to sit with for too long. Not the power, not the awareness, not even the distance it creates, but the silence that follows it. Because once you see through people, you also start seeing through yourself. The moments where you weren't just being kind, you were being strategic. The times you didn't speak, not because you had nothing to say, but because silence would do more. The connections that felt deep, but were quietly guided by what you chose to reveal and what you chose to hold back. And suddenly, the image you had of yourself begins to fracture, not completely, but enough. Enough to realize that identity isn't fixed. It adapts. It evolves. It responds to awareness. And the deeper that awareness goes, the less comfortable the answers become. Because now, you're left with something most people never fully confront. If you can influence people this easily, then so can they. If you can shape emotions, then so can anyone who understands how. And that means the world you thought was built on genuine reactions is layered with invisible intentions, not always malicious, but rarely pure. That doesn't mean connection is fake. It just means it's constructed. Fragile, dependent on things most people never notice. And maybe that's why awareness feels isolating, because you're no longer just experiencing life. You're seeing the mechanisms behind it. And once you see the mechanism, the illusion never feels the same again. So the question isn't whether empathy turned into manipulation. It's whether it was ever separate to begin with. And if you're honest, you already know the answer. Not because someone told you, but because you've seen it. In others, in moments, in yourself. And now that you've seen it, you can't unknow it. You can only decide what to do with it. If you've ever realized you understand people a little too well, comment aware and be honest. Does it feel like power or distance?